Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. How are you, Tim? How are you taking the heat in Sacramento?
Well, it really is the dog days of summer, and I take the heat by staying inside and not going out and doing yard work or anything sweaty. About the only thing I go out to do outside is, I do a lot of barbecuing this time of year. So when I'm using the barbecue, that's about the only time I'm outside. I don't even eat outside. It's so hot.
Well, I've been in search of a piano, as you know, for some time. And this weekend, I think I found the piano of my dreams. So I'm praying I can wrap it up this week. I've played a lot of pianos, and it was love at first sight. And when I played it, it was magic. It's not in my hands yet, so I won't go into the details, but it was a truly joyous weekend for me.
Well, hopefully we can have a piano performance on our podcast sometime after you have it home.
So we're going to try to keep the conversation short because we have a longer than usual podcast. I do want to mention, though, before that individual tickets are now on sale for our Northern California Gala on September 28th. And listeners, notice that I didn't say the San Francisco Gala. Our supporters weren't crazy about going into the city the last few years. So this year we're holding it at the Four Seasons in Silicon Valley, the same place we had our very successful dinner with Bjorn Lomborg. So for this Gala, our keynote speaker is Peter Thiel, entrepreneur and philanthropist, and our Toby Family Freedom Prize is going to go to Professor Chiron Skinner for her work in advancing freedom around the world. Many of our listeners know that Professor Skinner is a foreign policy expert, serving several administrations and edited books on Ronald Reagan. And we're going to try to acquire one of those books, actually, and have Professor Skinner sign it as a gift to our guests. So we hope you can come out for that. Details on our website at pacificresearch.org.
And if you're, now that we're talking about events, I hope everybody signs up for Tuesday, August 16th, when we're going to have a special live webinar with Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. For our listeners who remember, we had a great webinar with Secretary DeVos in fall of 2020, which made national news. So you can be sure that this webinar will be equally interesting and provocative. And she is the author of a new book called Hostages No More, The Fight for Education Freedom and the Future of the American Child. The webinar is free, and all you need to do to attend is to go to pacificresearch.org/events and register, and you'll get a Zoom link to tune into the webinar. And it's it's Tuesday, August 16th at 11 a.m. Pacific time. So we hope you'll be able to join us.
For some reason, you can't join us. It's going to be recorded. And also, we're going to turn it into a podcast.
Yep, you'll hear it in just a few weeks. Ro, why don't you tell us about today's podcast, which is a great luncheon that we had in Orange County last week?
Absolutely, Tim. Our guest for this week is Heather McDonald, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. This is a recording of her remarks at our recent luncheon at Newport Beach. And Heather is bi-coastal, so she spends part of her year in Manhattan and part of it here in Orange County. So we like to have her speak pretty much every summer. As you know, we suspended our luncheon speakers series during COVID for a couple of years. So we're happy to have that luncheon program back. Heather has been a long advocate of proactive policing since her book, The War on Cops, published in 2016. Heather, in this lecture, discusses the rise in crime as well as the impact of progressive prosecutors like Chesa Boudin and George Gascon. And while she doesn't have a book out now, her latest major project that came out last year was she contributed a chapter to the book A Dubious Expediency, edited by Gail Harriott, and we've got a podcast on that. Lance Azumi and I also contributed a chapter for that book. Ours is focused on Asian American discrimination in higher education.
Well, it's a really interesting podcast. She's also in a conversation with our Steve Smith, who I'm sure many of our listeners have read his blog posts on crime in California on our Right by the Bay blog. And I think it's a really interesting discussion on all the issues of crime and homelessness that still affect us despite all the many billions of dollars that state government is spending.
So thanks everyone for listening. And here's Heather McDonald and Steve Smith.
I would say California today is summed up in two vignettes. The first is from an article in the Los Angeles Times. Two female friends are reminiscing about how they first fell in love, not with a man, but with Venice Beach. One of the females recounted her pleasure in hearing waves crash against the shore when she woke up, and in letting her dog roam the sands while she made art. And here is the Times coy punchline: in her tent. It turns out that these two beach lovers were vagrants who had been colonizing the Venice boardwalk. The Times reporters made their experience normative. We were meant to see the world through their eyes. Their carefree beach lifestyle became the touchstone against which the rest of the world was measured. The second vignette concerns the reaction of retail stores in California to the shoplifting epidemic. Walgreens has closed 17 outlets in San Francisco over the last 5 years in response to a level of theft that is 4 times what Walgreens experiences nationwide. Rather than stand and fight, Walgreens has simply folded up the tent and left the field. Senior citizens who relied on those 17 Walgreens outlets for their medications and healthcare supplies were simply out of luck. Likewise, Target now closes all its San Francisco stores at 6 p.m. in the hope of avoiding more inventory losses. Any San Francisco worker who can't shop during the day is also out of luck. Starbucks is closing 6 outlets in Los Angeles because it too is unwilling to fight lawlessness. Both the Venice story and the store closings reveal the defining trait of California today. Let's call it the great inversion. The law-abiding and the hardworking are no longer the main concern of policy and elite attention. Instead, the interests of the deviant and the dependent govern. California is a living experiment in what happens when a society loses confidence in such bourgeois norms as personal responsibility, self-discipline, and respect for the law. The results are already in: spiraling crime, streets mired in squalor, and a poverty of values as well as income. Let's explore the most visible manifestation of the great inversion: homelessness. Street vagrants live in a protective bubble. Their occupation of public and private space is not just exempt from punishment, it is enabled by government-subsidized free tents, free cell phones, and free food. If those items are not immediately ready to hand, you can just steal them with impunity. Starbucks has told its employees in Los Angeles and San Francisco to let shoplifting vagrants walk out of their stores with whatever they want to take. Of course, this come-and-get-it policy does not protect employees from assault. It quite predictably has had the opposite effect, sending the message that anything goes. So Starbucks employees are regularly spit upon and cursed at. There are no consequences to these assaults. The perpetrators can come back the next day and steal some more. Is it any surprise that California has half the nation's homeless population? Behaviors that were once considered shameful are now conducted in plain view, enabled by government support. San Francisco relentlessly telegraphs that drug use is not only acceptable, but fully expected. Users dig for veins on the sidewalk. Health authorities distribute more than 4.5 million syringes a year, along with alcohol swabs and instructions on how to best tie a tourniquet. Needle disposal boxes have been erected outside the city's public toilets, signaling to children that drug use is a normal part of adult life. And now Los Angeles is following suit with its own so-called harm reduction program. California's vagrancy problems are not a naturally occurring phenomenon, arising inevitably out of poverty, inadequate welfare spending, or steep housing costs. Rather, they are a function of the loss of will, the will to enforce norms against street disorder. Decades ago, it would have been unthinkable to hold small business owners and their employees hostage to derelicts who use their premises as toilets and shooting galleries, or to expect homeowners to navigate around encampments while taking their children to school. Now, however, we put the phantom rights of the antisocial ahead of those of the law-abiding. Outgoing Los Angeles Councilman Mike Bonin proposed a permanent housing camp, homeless camp at Will Rogers State Beach in Pacific Palisades, another example of the great inversion. The only reason that the proposal didn't go forward was that it lacked adequate sewer access and electrical service. Otherwise, those two female Venice beachcombers could have moved into their new digs, while families out for a coastal outing would have had to dodge the inevitable feces, trash, and syringes. The Los Angeles Times has developed an entire genre of journalism around the homeless. Let's call it the "we are all vagrants now" genre. Only a few weeks this summer, over a few weeks, the Times ran several long "we are all vagrants now" stories on their front page. One lamented the plight of trash hoarders living in government-subsidized housing. These hoarders face a particularly difficult time moving to their next free housing gig, explained the Times, since they have so much trash to either take with them or, heaven forbid, discard. Did the Los Angeles Times follow up with a front page spread on the rent-paying residents who have to deal with the rats and stench from homeless hoarders? Of course not. We were meant simply to feel the injustice facing these homeless hoarders. Another massive front page story was called, quote, "Pregnant and Homeless." It introduced us to a 22-year-old, 7-month pregnant female. Am I allowed to still say that? Or should I say birthing person? Who has been living in a tent over the 101 freeway. She's been on the streets of Hollywood since age 13. We are supposed to feel that her challenges are due to LA's lack of compassion. Did the LA Times run a front page story on the couples who wait until they are married to have children and who work to support those children, but who struggle in the face of rising energy costs and crime? Of course not. Such bourgeois values as temperance, deferred gratification, and sexual responsibility are just forms of white privilege. California is lifting taxes on marijuana because those taxes burden marijuana dealers unfairly. Meanwhile, of course, gas taxes are kept high and intact. In May of this year, the Times reported on a jail diversion program run out of the LAPD's 77th Precinct in Watts. It allows criminals to avoid jail if they accept housing and treatment. 3/4 of those eligible for the program have turned it down, since enrolling would crimp their anything-goes party and predation lifestyle. So much for the lie that homelessness is a housing problem. UCLA law professor Gary Blasi explained why we should not expect criminals to take up the free housing and treatment offer. Whether a program works, explained Blasi, depends on whether, quote, "from the point of view of the person involved, the alternative offered is better." In other words, these criminals have the right to turn down taxpayer-subsidized shelter in order to continue colonized public space if the shelter rules don't suit them. What if this doesn't work for the, quote, "point of view of the taxpayers"? Too bad. Public policy revolves around criminal needs, their preferences, and phantom rights. You and I, by contrast, have no choice regarding whether criminals and vagrants colonize our neighborhoods and destroy our sense of safety. Gary Blasi, by the way, has been for decades one of the most pernicious forces of disorder and lawlessness in Southern California. He is therefore naturally the go-to source for the Los Angeles Times. What about those closed Walgreens, Target, and Starbucks stores? Their capitulation is part of a broader abandonment of law and order. And that abandonment is being driven by one thing: disparate impact. And here we get to the impetus behind nearly every aspect of the great inversion. There is not a single standard of behavior or accomplishment that does not have a disparate impact on so-called underrepresented minorities, i.e., blacks and Hispanics. That is not because America is systemically racist. It is because of vast behavioral and academic achievement gaps that may not be discussed in polite company. Take Los Angeles. Blacks are 9% of the population, but commit 46% of homicides. Whites are 28% of the Los Angeles population, but commit 4% of homicides, most of those domestic violence, not street crime. A black Angelino is 35 times as likely to commit a homicide as a white Angelino. The victims of these homicides are themselves disproportionately black. Such disparities mean that the LAPD and the LA County Sheriff's Department cannot go to where people are most being victimized by violent crime without concentrating on minority neighborhoods. Those whom they stop and arrest based on victim and witness descriptions will be overwhelmingly black. The police do not wish this reality. It is forced on them by the reality of crime. The only way to end the disparate impact of law enforcement on blacks is to end law enforcement entirely. And that is what we are doing. You can understand everything in our criminal justice landscape today if you understand the power of the disparate impact conceit. Walgreens, Target, and Starbucks would rather deprive themselves of revenues than accost shoplifters, because accosting those shoplifters means disproportionately accosting minorities, and that means being accused of racism. Do you puzzle at the clearly antisocial policies of Los Angeles District Attorney George Gascon and the late unlamented Chesa Boudin, former DA of San Francisco? Puzzle no longer. It is all about disparate impact. Boudin and Gascon announced that they would not prosecute a range of offenses from trespass to disorderly conduct and driving without a license. Why? Because prosecuting those laws would mean disproportionately charging blacks. The Los Angeles DA George Gascon will not charge suspects with resisting arrest. The reason, again, is disparate impact. Gascon's declaration strikes at the heart of civilization itself, since law enforcement officers are the embodiment of the rule of law. The resisting arrest carve-out is particularly unfathomable in light of the attempted assassination of 2 Los Angeles sheriff's deputies in September 2020 and the ambush assassination of 2 El Monte officers this last June. Since an amnesty for resisting arrest sends the message of contempt for the law enforcement profession entirely. The suspect in the September 2020 sheriff's deputies ambush, longtime felon Dante Murray, walked up to the deputies' parked squad car and shot them both in the head as they sat inside. Bystanders cheered. Anti-cop protesters continued the celebration later at the hospital when the deputies were on life support. This last June, Justin Flores ambushed 2 El Monte officers responding to a domestic violence call in a motel. Flores fatally shot both in the head, stole another gun from one of the dying officers, and got into a shootout with other cops in the motel parking lot. In 2021, Flores had been arrested for possessing an illegal gun, which should have qualified him for a 3-strike sentencing enhancement. But DA Gascon has ended the 3-strike enhancement, and so it put Flores back on probation, where he was back on the streets ready to kill again. Why has Gascon refused to carry out the voters' will regarding these 3-strike enhancements? Because doing so has a disparate impact on minorities. Better to let criminals go free and the innocent be murdered than to put a disproportionate share of minorities in prison. California is emptying its prisons to reduce so-called mass incarceration, a misnomer since what we have is mass crime, not mass incarceration. The only reason for this concern about the state prison population is that blacks are disproportionately represented among inmates. The imprisonment rate for black men is 10 times the rate for white men, not, again, because the system is racist, but because the black crime rate is at least that much higher. If whites were disproportionately represented among the state's inmates, no one would give a damn. The reaction would be, throw away the key. George Gascon claims that, quote, lives in our communities have been destroyed by harsh, unjust, and deadly police practices, unquote. A brief translation. Communities is code for blacks and Hispanics. Whites don't have communities in the eyes of the left. They just have bunkers, at least if they are Trump voters. But Gascon's statement about the police is a shameful lie. Blacks' astronomical death by homicide rate, 13 times the rate of whites, is not due to the police, it is not due to whites, it is due to other blacks. The police could end all use of lethal force tomorrow, and it would have virtually zero effect on the black death by homicide rate. Last month, 2 felons went on a horrifying crime spree at 7-Eleven stores throughout LA, Orange, and Riverside counties. A customer was robbed and fatally shot outside of a 7-Eleven store in Santa Ana. A few minutes later, a customer was fatally shot outside of a 7-Eleven store in Brea. A La Habra clerk and customer were shot a few hours later. Another shot customer in Riverside is in grave condition. These felons were not off the streets because incarceration would contribute to racial disparities in the prison population. So how does California pull back from this spiral of lawlessness, predation, and squalor? By re-inverting the great inversion. The state must put the interests of the law-abiding and hardworking ahead of the interests of the criminal and deviant. We need to declare unambiguously that the expectation of safety and freedom from fear is not a manifestation of white privilege. It is the basic entitlement of anyone living under constitutional government. No one should apologize for wanting to live in a clean, orderly environment. That is not a form of racism. It is a form of sanity. No one should apologize for not wanting homeless facilities in his backyard. NIMBYism is a rational and legitimate response to the patent failures of the homeless industrial complex. Wear your NIMBYism proudly. Demand that homeless facilities be placed outside of residential and commercial areas, ideally in abandoned industrial or rural land, outside of cities where the drug addicted have the best chance of going clean. Your children should not be exposed to junkies masturbating and shooting up. Your neighborhoods should not be exposed to fires from homeless encampments, as recently engulfed a freeway underpass in West Oakland, destroying SUVs and RVs. Both the homeless crisis and the crime crisis can be solved with one simple thing: enforcement. You don't allow people to camp out on the streets, period. You move them along. You don't allow gangbangers to rule the streets. When you stop enforcing the law, you don't get racial equity, you get chaos. Officers must be allowed to stop suspicious persons and to make arrests without the fear of being called racist. Their police chiefs and mayors must back them up and tell the truth about racial crime rates. Gang databases must be reactivated. The most basic duty of government is to provide public safety so that citizens can engage in the marvelous drama of free enterprise without worrying about being shot in their workplaces, and so that families can raise children in a zone of innocence. The benefit of the doubt should always go to the law-abiding, and the burden of proof should always rest with the lawless. If you have committed crimes already, you no longer deserve the benefit of the doubt. We are not going to continue trying to keep you out of prison in the hope of rehabilitating you. You have forfeited your right to be at the top of our policy-making concern. Are Californians ready to reject the great inversion? Well, the Chesa Boudin recall was a promising sign, but the real test will come with the LA mayoral election and the George Gascon recall. I cannot say that I'm optimistic, but I'm a pessimist by nature. Fortunately, we have the Pacific Research Institute to make the case for legitimate authority, and we have people like you in this room who, unlike Walgreens, have not yet jumped ship and who have stayed to fight for the most ravishing, beautiful state in the Union, one that retains the potential to once again lead the country in opportunity and entrepreneurship. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Getting back to the war on cops, could you discuss the impact of these laws on the practice of law enforcement, and as well as how it's affecting morale, retention, and recruiting in law enforcement as well?
Well, officers obviously feel like if they know that a prosecutor is not going to prosecute an arrest, why make the arrest? They're not that masochistic. I mean, it's pretty masochistic to be a police officer today. And we are in the middle of a massive recruiting crisis, where since the George Floyd race riots that began in June 2020 with the death in Minneapolis of George Floyd, this was the 9-minute knee on the neck by Derek Chauvin, that led to just horrible months of race rioting. LA, Beverly Hills, Gene Block, the chancellor of UCLA, the awful chancellor of UCLA, Gene Block, apologized afterwards for allowing LAPD officers to muster in one of UCLA's VA parking lots because having LAPD officers on site made UCLA students feel afraid. Meanwhile, the businesses in Santa Monica and Beverly Hills that were being torched and plundered, they're not supposed to be afraid. You know, just let them riot was the answer. So officers are demoralized. It's a combination of the laws, but I place as much blame on the rhetoric. And Joe Biden ran his presidential campaign picking up on the theme that Obama made ubiquitous, which is that black parents are right to fear that their children can be killed by a cop every time they step outside. Well, in 2020, there were 50 black children gunned down and fatally in drive-by shootings. These are kids that are 1-year-olds, 1-month-olds, 3-month-olds, 3-year-olds, playing on trampolines in their backyards, in their bedrooms, in their parents' car, at birthday parties, gunned down. Not one of them was killed by a cop. They were all killed by black gangbangers. I can tell you the only thing that's going to turn this thing around is if white kids start getting gunned down in drive-by shootings. The press does not give a damn about black lives. Can you imagine if 50 white kids were gunned down in drive-by shootings? There would be a national revolution. So Obama started saying this. Biden, when he was a candidate, said it. He repeated in his so-called unifying inaugural speech. I was like, my jaw was hanging open at the press response among conservatives, among like National Review to Obama's inaugural speech, where he accused whites of being white supremacists. But whites are so passive at this point that they just take it. They say, yeah, we're white supremacists. That was unifying. And since then, he has continued this lie that the police are the threat facing black children and blacks generally, not black criminals. And that is a very hard thing if you're a police officer to work under.
Hey, I might add that San Francisco PD, who's already down 400 officers, only have 3 candidates approved to attend their upcoming police academy.
Yeah.
Wow. Nobody is applying. Let's take a question.
Best advice, living through some years of this going on with the police profession, what's your best advice to him today?
So it's somebody who has now graduated and he's on the job market. The one thing officers face is like, how much action do they want? And I look at, these guys, it's hilarious. I walk on the weekends very early around Irvine, And the Irvine police are always traveling in pairs of these massive SUVs. You think, really? Like, you need backup in Irvine? You know, but so there's some people who want to be in Irvine, and then there's others, you know, the sort of guy type that really want action. And so for that, you know, you go to Baltimore. You go to the south side of Chicago. Chicago, you know, we all talk about Chicago. Chicago does not have the highest crime rate. We all talk about Chicago because it's prominent and there's the Magnificent Mile and it's got, in absolute numbers, its highest, but rates, it doesn't compare to Detroit, Baltimore, Louisville, Baton Rouge. If he wants action, you know, he should go to one of those areas, but he should be prepared for a very uncomfortable time on the street. Because officers do find now when they get out of their cars, in the rare instances when they are making a discretionary investigatory stop, meaning they're not responding to a 911 call that there's already been a crime, those they have to go to. If somebody's called in a robbery, that cop has to go there and take a report. What he does not have to do, and this is what is not happening, and this is why crime is rising. He does not have to get out of his car and ask questions to somebody acting suspiciously. So in those stops, and sometimes even just responding to a 911 call, officers find themselves cursed at. The cell phones are immediately out in officers' faces. So it's a very hard thing, but I have to say, I did a report on the police academy in New York years ago. I mean, it was before Michael Brown, and it was extremely uplifting because these younger people were motivated by a sense of public spiritedness. And I would say this as well, as duplicitous as our race narrative is today, it can make you optimistic to go to a police precinct, because there you will find, by and large, post-racial society, where the black and white and Hispanic officers are united against a common enemy, which is the criminal. And they tell themselves, you know, the good people of the community support me. So you know, it's sort of like the military, there's bonding, and so it's good for that, but I don't really know. It would be a very tough decision, and one that would entail a lot of sacrifice, but obviously would be a great contribution to the country, because we sure need more law and order right now.
Heather, when I first read War on Cops, I thought there was so much statistical information that was so important that the pendulum would swing back the other way. It hasn't happened. And all I can conclude is you are one courageous woman to keep hammering on this subject. I fear for your own safety. But have you had serious thoughts on your own life?
I was doxxed once by Black Lives Matter activists. Doxing means when they put all your personal information on the web. And so a BLM chapter in, I forget where, someplace in the middle of the country said, well, racist journalists don't get it, but they'd been doxing everybody right and left at that point. And they said, well, racist journalists don't get a pass. So at that point I was in New York, and I did have NYPD sent a police protection outside my apartment. They were very grateful that I lived in a typical New York high-rise, because it provides anonymity. You know, it's different than living in a house where you could be, you know, scouted out more. So nothing came of that, fortunately.
I think the only good cop in LA County is the sheriff.
Well, I was surprised, you know, I'm bi-coastal, and when I came back, when I left California to sadly go back to New York last October, so October of 2021, Villanueva was the hero. And then I come back to California, to Irvine, in April, and at least that guy Leo Terrell on KABC had this vendetta against Villanueva for wanting to have, I guess, exclusive control of school safety. So I thought, well, that's weird. Like, what's happened to Villanueva's reputation? But that may have just been a blip of dissatisfaction. I don't know. But yeah, I think he's been pretty good, and is willing to not back down. But
part of the problem, the people that bundle money for these people, they live in Beverly Hills, Pacific Palisades, or Malibu, where they have the windows of their limousines tinted just dark enough that they don't have to see the tent cities the rest of us drive past every single day. Is that part of it?
It's a mystery, and you guys that are here all year round, if you know some of these people, I would just ask them, but I completely agree with you. I think that George Soros is too much of a conservative bugaboo. People want, there's a negative phrase, but they want a conspiracy, they want agency, they want somebody in particular whom they can finger for all our problems. If we just got rid of George Soros, everything would be okay. I think that's simplistic. Now, I may be unduly blasé about George Soros, but I'll tell you, I would bet that if Soros's money was taken out of the system, I would be willing to bet that not all that much would change, because at this point, what you have that's more important than Soros is you have the entirety of the mainstream media, you have the entirety of university culture, which every year belches out another couple 100,000 of brainwashed students that go to Google, populate these corporations, terrify the CEOs who are still using male and female and, might have some shred of meritocratic hiring left. So I think that the problem is a ideology of white guilt, of terror about being able to speak neutrally about the need for law and order, that whites are going around flagellating themselves for phantom racism because they do not want to look hard on at the terrifying cultural breakdown of the inner city, which is driving these crime rates. So yeah, I'm sure there's money, but it is narcissism that people believe that in supporting clearly counterproductive, antisocial activities, they are proving that they are anti-racist. That is what is driving all of this.
It's only in places like think tanks right now where these conversations can occur, and on the few private university campuses that are going to protect First Amendment rights and the open exchange of ideas. Heather herself has been confronted campus visits and forced to speak to empty auditoriums to her audience that is online because of the university system that simply doesn't want to hear opposing ideas right now. Someone had a question. Yes, ma'am.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
To what extent do you see poverty influencing the roots of all this crime coming from the inner city, and might economic opportunity ultimately be back in the churches?
I don't see poverty as driving this as driving the crime. I see family breakdown as driving the crime. There are lots of poor people who do not commit crime. America's safest period in its history was the Great Depression, when nobody had any money. These kids that are out there beating people up, drive-by shootings have no economic motivation. It is a function of a total lack of socialization of these young males that are growing up in not just to a single mother, but in a culture that no longer recognizes marriage as anything valuable or necessary. And so young males are growing up without any need to learn the most basic bourgeois virtues of self-control, impulse control, deferred gratification to make themselves a viable mate. And again, what is driving some 16-year-old to drive up to a city block and start shooting randomly? That is not because he lost his job at McDonald's. He never had a job at McDonald's. And I'll tell you this, social media is police officers' best friend, because all of these mindless gangbangers have smartphones and they can't resist throwing their stupid gang signs on their smartphones and putting it up on YouTube, showing off with their guns and their money. We are not a poor society. There is nobody in the United States who is poor today. We all enjoy a standard of living that is just thousands of times higher than 100 years ago. So this is a cultural breakdown. It is not an economic problem. I am completely against mass illegal immigration, mass low-skilled immigration, completely. It is transforming California culture. We are turning into a poverty state. But I will say this, that mass illegal immigrants serve as a benchmark, because although we're now seeing a greater Hispanic homeless population, by and large they work. And they are showing that there are jobs out there. The problem with the black underclass is not that there's no jobs, it's there's no work ethic. Yeah, it's always bad when you have law-abiding people leaving neighborhoods, and it leaves, a less of a bulwark. Policing is not the ideal solution to crime. It's the second best solution. The best solution is families and communities, and, to get back to that time when neighbors were willing to call out the antisocial behavior. I mean, I really have to restrain myself on subways or in California streets when I see somebody littering, because it drives me crazy. I cannot understand what sort of mentality would lead somebody to drop his hamburger wrapper on the ground. And I still, occasionally say something, but I am taking my life in my hands. It's very bad now. So, but ideally you have those communities where the older people can rein in the young kids that are acting up. And so when then people who understand the necessity for law and order leave, it's going to lead to what, has been written about a lot, which is the potential of a even more radically bifurcated state, with the very wealthy behind their, limos and chauffeurs that prefer not to see through their tinted windows the tents all around on, it's now on Beverly Drive or La Cienega in LA. I mean, there's no place it's not.
Watching CNN and NPR, but do you ever get invited to any of these outlets to get this message out? Because this is so inbred, and you are articulate, and you need to get that message out. Do you ever get an invitation to do that?
No, I mean, it's a complete double standard. Fox News or the Wall Street Journal, they are much more interested in differences of opinion. CNN and MSNBC are absolutely monolithic. When my War on Cops book came out in 2016, the timing was sadly apt, because there had just been the ambush assassination of 5 police officers in Dallas by a black nationalist who was out to kill cops. And so there's my book coming out called The War on Cops. It just come out. So I was contacted by CNN to come on and talk. It was going to be like a Saturday morning interview. And the day before, they just canceled. So they couldn't even tolerate that degree of dissent from the received opinion. So this is why, this is a whole nother discussion, how difficult it is to crack the tech monopoly, and that's way beyond my knowledge, but it's a real problem.
Yeah, I'd like to circle back around to homelessness. What your very first remarks about things becoming normative is just so right on. I think of that when I walk with my grandchildren and who we walk past, and I think they think this is just how life is supposed to be, as I'm remembering what my life was growing up at their age. Right. We often know what to do at the larger level, I suppose, through the ballot box, but what do we do, those of us sitting here in our own communities, related to homelessness? What is it that we can do?
Well, yeah, I don't know what the political outlets you have are, but what needs to happen is the police just do need to enforce anti-camping laws, and they have to move them along. Now, we've got problems in California with some legal precedents. There was first Jones, which was brought by the wife of the judge I clerked for in LA, Stephen Reinhart. Ramona Ripston was head of the Southern California ACLU, and sued, and won in the Ninth Circuit a rule saying that you can't enforce any vagrancy laws unless there's housing available for every damn last person who purports to be on the streets. And that ruling got reinforced with something called Martin v. Boise, where a similar idea came out of Boise, Idaho. So those are challenging precedents to go up against. But that is the only thing that is going to solve this. Housing is not the issue. I'm sure you guys know this. They're offered housing, they don't take it. They don't take it. Give them the option and they will stay on the streets. They cannot have the option. As I say, for decades the police would move people along. You don't know where to go, you figure it out. It's not on us. You know, I would again build low-cost congregate shelters outside. The idea that we're going to give everybody in San Francisco an $800,000 private apartment with bath and kitchenette and all sorts of nice things is ludicrous. It would, you know, it would bankrupt the whole state of California. So if you can get the message to your local politicians that you're willing to back them against the inevitable outcry from the advocates, and the advocates want the homeless on the street, because for them, the homeless are the living embodiment of the evils of capitalism. That's all it's about, is that you keep them on the street so you can say, this is a racist, greed-filled, white privilege system, and we need to redistribute more. We need to tax the wealthy higher in order to build housing that these people are never going to use.
Lynn Hackman with the Epic Times. I'm curious if there are statistics since Gaston's been in office as to the recidivism of the people that they are letting out. Long-term, people are being let out, and short, and they're not keeping. Do you know, are there statistics available on, are they just they go in, they come back out, they commit more time, and they victimize more people?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would say, again, referring to the El Monte case, but I don't know those statistics ready to hand, but that would be a good question.
If I could add just real quickly to the statistics question, this is the nerd propeller spinning. The Attorney General has not released the 2021 crime statistics, ostensibly because the entire system is under investigation because of the CCW information leak from the Department of Justice. In addition to that, the FBI does not have accurate 2021 crime statistics because 40% of the law enforcement agencies in America didn't contribute crime statistics. So we're working in a real vacuum right now, and we're looking at it real hard at PRI.
I'll tell you this. You may be aware that there's an effort to end the submission of SATs for college applicants for seniors in California. UC has not just said we don't want your SATs, you may not submit them. Receiving SATs does not prevent schools from having racial preferences, because what schools do is just do something known as race norming, which is having two completely different scales for evaluating white SATs, white and Asian SATs, and black and Hispanic SATs. So, you know, if you're applying to UC Berkeley, and this is all despite Prop 209, because they're all breaking the law through their teeth, so we'll just leave that aside. So you're applying to UC Berkeley. If you're white or Asian, you better have like 1450s on your combined SAT score at least on a 1600 scale. If you're black and Hispanic, you can probably get in with 1100s or 1200s easily. So having SATs allows schools to make fine differentiations among different groups of people. Why wouldn't they want the information? They can ignore it in the case of blacks and Hispanics, or just race norm it and do it on a different scale. So why are they saying we want to shut these things down? To destroy all remaining evidence of the academic skills gap. They want to put the College Board, which is the organization, the beleaguered organization that for years has fielded these accusations that the SATs are racist, which they're not. They have been combed for, you know, questions about a regatta. There's not been a question about a regatta in the SATs for 100 years. So they go over any question that has a larger than usual variance in correct answers between whites and blacks. They throw it out. So it's not a racist test. But they want to destroy the College Board. And that is happening for crime statistics too. It is very, very hard to get racial crime data. The NYPD has it, the LAPD has it, kind of. Chicago used to have it, but that's kind of it. Maybe a few places have it at a state level on an annual basis. They want to get rid of that data so that we can continue with this myth that if the police arrest blacks more, it's not because of crime, it's because of racism.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.